Excellent.
Okay, great. Brittany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Welcome, everyone. So thank you for joining us for our first study hall of 2021. My name is Brittany Wood, and I'm going to be your host today. And from our customer care team, we have Jeannie Clark, AJ Ootman, and Holly Vasich. All right, so just to get started with our town hall today, we're going to be focused on advanced imports, files, features, and how-tos in version 12. So we do expect that there are going to be many questions. So if you do have questions, please be sure to use the Zoom chat feature, which you will find by moving your mouse towards the bottom of the Zoom screen. Some questions will be reserved to discuss at the end during our Q&A session. Now, as a reminder, this webinar is recorded, and for audio quality, everyone is muted. We will follow up with a link to this recording, our chat transcript, and the sample files reviewed today. So let's begin. All right, so what exactly is advanced import and how can it be used? Advanced import is a new tool for WebCheckout admins to have more control over their imports and hopefully reduce import errors and headache. Featured in version 12, Advanced Import now includes its own interface with just one screen to import all importable fields, updates to import files, which now include a configuration section and a data section, the ability to import to custom properties, the ability to update all data fields, including the record's unique identifier and origin. When updating existing records already in WebCheckout, only the record's unique identifier and just the fields being updated are required. Default behavior of patron and section member imports is now to add records, and to inactivate omitted records, the action, which we'll review today, must be explicitly stated. Resource and resource type files do not need to be imported together. And finally, patron signature on file data is now importable. So we'll begin today's session with a review of the new import files, and then we'll review the import data app. And finally, we'll update some files together to show how to add new resources, update existing resource records, and use actions, which is a new import setting we'll review today, to maintain the expected import behavior of inactivating patrons and section members omitted from the file. For those of you in version 10 and version 11, there are limited advanced import features, so I do highly recommend upgrading to version 12 to access all of the benefits of advanced imports. Now, before we dive into the advanced import file, I do want to note that in version 12, you can still import the files you are currently used to which we refer to as the deprecated import files. In WebCheckout's Find pages, if you are exporting records in the original importable format, you'll want to choose the deprecated export importable option. The keyword here is deprecated, as these files will eventually be phased out and only the advanced import files will be accepted in the new versions to come. Let's get started with a basic overview of the advanced import files. All right, all of the files that we're going to be reviewing today will be made available to everyone after our call in our regular follow-up email, and we will post these documents to our documentation site. So if you learn best by seeing examples, you will have these sample files to reference. Let's review the differences and similarities between the advanced and the deprecated import files, and we'll use the patron file as an example. Now on your screen, you should now see a sample of the advanced patron import file. And on the other tab, we have the deprecated patron import file. So you'll notice that there are now two sections on all advanced import files: the configuration section and the data section. The data section is very similar to the deprecated import file, and you'll notice that the data is formatted the same way underneath different column headers. So here are our column headers, and if we compare that to the patron file, you'll notice that the file looks very similar in the data section. Now the data section is found at the bottom of the advanced import file and begins underneath this begin data header and continues all the way until the end of the file. This begin data row must be included on the import file, so please do not delete this. The data section consists of headers with information or data falling below each header. So the data simply appears underneath each header in this section, just as it did on the deprecated file. Now you may also notice differences in the data header names and formatting changes to value in the advanced import files. So for example, if we take a look at the deprecated patron import file, you'll notice that it looks very similar to the bottom of the advanced patron import file. The same information is present on both of these files. However, there are a few slight differences, such as this person ID header has been updated to user ID on the advanced import, and for files containing a value, you can now include the currency sign and decimal. Now, in all advanced import files, some column header names have changed, and these changes have been documented and included on the exported files. The other key difference and feature of the advanced import files is that excluding data columns will not be overwritten or cleared out of the existing record. So for our example, when we're using the deprecated file, if we go ahead and delete the email column entirely, WebCheckout would remove the email address from these patrons' records in WebCheckout. Now instead, on the advanced patron import file, if we were to remove the email column, this field simply does not get updated. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we review configuration settings. So overall, some key concepts to remember about the data section is that the data section is very similar to the deprecated import files. So this is where your data goes. The begin data row is required, so please do not delete this. A few headers have been renamed, but most remain the same. There are some minor changes to formatting, such as in the value columns. Excluded columns will no longer be overwritten when importing data. You can now import to custom properties. And with this in mind, we always recommend reviewing our documentation when setting up the data section to ensure that you have correct header names and accepted values are formatted correctly. However, if you understand the deprecated import file, you should have no trouble updating the data section of the advanced import file. A new concept of the advanced import file is the configuration section. So the configuration section is found at the top of the file underneath this begin config header up until the data section. So this is all the configuration section. The configuration section is where settings are defined for the import. This section is required, so it must remain on the import file, and you may need to make some changes to this section. We'll begin with a review of each of these configuration settings, and then we'll review how to update them for different import scenarios that we'll review today. So first we have version. So this setting should not be changed, and the value should be set to 2. So please be sure to leave version set to 2. Type. This is required and defines the kind of data that the file contains, such as person or resource data. Only one type can be included in this field, and the value is predefined. The type is automatically set when you export an importable file from WebCheckout. Also, if you download file templates from our documentation site, the predefined type will also be included. In this file, the type is set to person so that we can import people data. Origin. Origin is required, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with origin, it is intended to signify how the data was created, either from an import file or from within the application. There are two default origins, external and local. External origin typically means that the data was created via import. External is the default origin when importing new records. Local origin typically means that data was created within WebCheckout and is the default origin when creating new records manually one by one. The origin will automatically be set to external in all caps on all exported importable files from WebCheckout. Now you may need to edit the origin value depending on the origin of your data in WebCheckout and the goals of your import. If you are unsure what the origin is of your current data, you can view this information by including origin as a result column on the related find page. Now, many clients have created custom origins, and that custom origin should be set as a value when importing records to that origin. Now, please note that origin is case sensitive, and the default origin of imported records is external in all caps. Label. This is a text field to include any relevant information about the import. For example, you may want to include a date of when this file was imported here. This field is not required and can be omitted. Lookup columns. This field is required and must include the imported type's unique identifier. This field defines the primary key or the unique value of the record, so WebCheckout knows which record is being updated. Unique identifiers are noted in the info icon of the Import Data app and in our documentation. We'll review how to find unique identifiers using the Import Data app in just a few minutes. In the person file, we can use either user ID or we could also use barcode as the unique identifier. Currently, our file is set to use user ID as the lookup column. Import columns. This field is required and defines the fields that may be updated by the import file. Only fields to be updated from the data section should be included as an import column. This option allows you to be very intentional about the data that is being updated by this import. We recommend only including the fields that you are intending on importing to or updating to minimize errors. So for example, if I only wanted to update first name, last name, and patron class, I would only include these 3 column headers as import columns. Essentially, this means that the row will include column headers that are in the, so this is where you're going to define the columns that you're updating from the import. Non-import columns. This field is only required if the data section includes columns that you do not want to update from the import. Essentially, this means that this row will include column headers that are included in this data section below, but are not a lookup column or an import column. Again, this field defines the columns that are included on the file, but do not need to be updated. So to prevent data from being updated or overwritten via import, you now have 2 options. The first option, if the column is included in the data section and the import column section, you can just move that column header to the non-import column. So if you want to exclude a column header and it's included in the data section, you would move that column header from import column to non-import columns. The second option is to just delete that column entirely from the data section and as an import column. This is easier and is my preferred method. The addition of the import columns and the non-import column fields ensures that mass updates of data are intentional and minimizes errors and unintentional changes to your data. So for example, for those of you looking to protect a field from nightly integration or regular patron imports, you can now simply exclude that column or list that column as a non-import column on the file. In short, all column headers from the data section must be included as a lookup column, import column, or non-import column. action. So the action setting is the newest feature to the advanced import files and became available in version 12. The action setting controls whether omitted records from the import file will be deactivated or kept active. The action is only available on the patron, group, section, department code, and account import files. Today we'll focus on how actions are used on group and patron files. If the action value is left blank, omitted records from the import file will be ignored and remain active, making the import file only additive. This is new behavior in version 12 and is the default behavior. So if your goal is to update a few records or just add a few new records without inactivating records already in WebCheckout, you can either leave the action field blank or you can delete this row entirely. To continue the same behavior in previous versions where excluded patrons and section members from the import file are inactivated in WebCheckout, the action setting must specifically include the correct deactivate excluded action. To inactivate records when data is excluded from these files, the action value must either be set to deactivate excluded or deactivate excluded members based on the file type. Deactivate excluded can be included on the patron, group, or section file and will inactivate records when the record is excluded from the import file. Deactivate excluded members can be included also on the section file and will inactivate section members not included on the section member file. We'll go into details of each of these actions when we update files together. There are also two supplementary action options, which can be used in addition to these deactivate actions. The supplementary options are unsafe and verbose. Unsafe, when added to the file, will allow deactivation of all patrons, groups, sections, and members when the import file includes no data in the data section. Our general recommendation with unsafe is to only include if your institution inactivates all patrons, groups, sections, or section members periodically and no active records are on the file. An example of this would be if you inactivate all patrons during breaks or at the end of the semester. The patron file can then include unsafe and the data section include no records. This would inactivate all patrons. If your institution always has active patrons, groups, sections, or members, and the presence of no data would likely be due to error, we recommend omitting unsafe. If unsafe is excluded from the file, WebCheckout will not deactivate patrons, sections, or members if no data is present. The second supplementary option is verbose. When added to the file, WebCheckout will display a list of deactivated data on the Import Data app. Please keep in mind that unsafe and verbose actions can only be included in addition to these deactivate actions. Now, if you'll notice on my example file, I've included all three options that are available on the patron file: deactivate excluded, unsafe, and verbose. This means that WebCheckout will inactivate any patrons omitted from this file of the external origin. In addition to the inactivation of omitted records, because I've also added unsafe, if I were to remove all of the patrons from this data section here at the bottom, the import will inactivate all patrons of the origin of external. Now, finally, because I've also added verbose, I'm going to see feedback on the import data screen showing the patron records that have been inactivated from this import. We'll review these actions in a bit more detail when we review import scenarios. All right, now in summary, the configuration section defines settings or options for the import. Version should always be set to 2. Type will automatically be set on the exported importable file in WebCheckout or by downloading files from our documentation. Lookup columns defines the unique identifier. Remember, the unique identifier is how WebCheckout recognizes which records are being updated. Import columns define the columns that may be updated by this import. Non-import columns defines the columns not to be updated by the import, but are included on the file. And finally, action only needs to be included if your goal is to deactivate records that are excluded from the patron, group, section, or section member files. Now, this was our introduction to the advanced import file, and we'll review how to actually update our files in just a minute. So now we're going to turn our attention to the import data app and how we can use this to assist us with our import files. So now I'm logged into WebCheckout on my screen, and you can access the import data app by clicking on the apps menu and then selecting import data. Next, you will be prompted to log in again, and you may need to select your organization. Now on the import data screen, there are 3 icons on the top left-hand corner of the screen. The first icon allows you to toggle back to this import data screen. This is actually where you'll import your data. The second icon is the option to view import type information with a drop-down menu to select details for each importable type. This is documentation of all available importable fields that you can review right in the import data app. And finally, with this third icon, you can review the integration logs, which tells you when and what was imported. Let's review the import type information screen. This import documentation replaces the comment section that previously appeared at the top of the exported importable files in version 10 or 11. Using this screen, you can select the import type to see more information. So let's take a look at information for the person import. Here you can view information underneath 4 different headers: unique ID properties, updatable properties, required new row properties, and available actions. Unique ID properties displays the available unique identifiers, which can be used as a lookup column in the configuration setting of the advanced import file. So if you'll remember from our person advanced import file, this is our lookup column. And currently we have user ID set. On the import data app, we can use either user ID or barcode as the lookup column for the patron file. Now, because advanced import gives you the control to set the lookup value, you can update the user ID, for example, by setting barcode as the lookup value. Next, we have updatable properties. Updatable properties displays the column header names of all fields that can be updated via import. All updatable properties can be included as an import column and in the data section of the file. So as a quick reminder, any updatable property can be included as an import column. So the setting right here, and you would also want to include it in the data section. Now, this field also includes custom properties unique to your instance of WebCheckout, as well as accepted values. So here are 2 custom properties on my instance. So all updatable properties can be included both as an import column and in the data section. Next, we have required new row properties. This displays the minimum requirements to import new data. So for example, to import new patron records, the minimum required information to include is user ID, first name, and last name. And finally, we have available actions. Available actions only displays if actions are available for that file. We see that the deactivate excluded, as well as the unsafe and verbose action are available on the patron import file. But if we take a look at the resource information, you'll notice that there is no available action section, as actions do not apply to resources. Now, this is a great reference point if you are looking for more direction on what can be included on the advanced import file. I highly recommend referencing the documentation found in the Import Data app when updating your advanced import docs, especially if you are looking to import to a custom property, as it will include custom property field names and accepted values. If you would like to review additional information, you can always access our completed advanced import documentation, which defines all of the configuration settings we reviewed today and the default importable fields by clicking on this question mark icon. So now that we've reviewed the advanced import files, let's actually apply what we learned to common import scenarios. So we're going to start with a review of how to create brand new resources. Then we'll review how to update existing resource records using the export as importable option in WebCheckout. And finally, we'll end with a review of how to update patron and group files to maintain the same behavior of those imports so that data integration and regular imports inactivate records excluded from the file. Let's begin by importing new resources. So we're going to start by downloading the Resource Advanced Import template from our documentation site. So this is our documentation for the resource import for advanced imports. And you'll notice on our documentation site, we provide templates and you can click the option to download a blank template file. Now, just to save time, I've already downloaded this file and opened it within Google Sheets. But your file, if you were to download it from our documentation, will look just like this. Now, as you can see, the template file includes configuration settings and information and all default data headers. All we need to do is adjust the information and add new resources. Let's begin by adjusting the configuration section using what we learned earlier. So version, we're going to leave this set to 2. Type, we'll leave this set to resource since we're importing new resource records. Origin, we'll leave this set to external in all caps since we're adding new resources. Now, we recommend leaving origin set to external unless you are familiar with origin and specifically want to import to a different origin. Label, this isn't required and can be deleted, but we'll label this import as study hall new resource import just so we can easily reference what this import was for. Now for lookup columns, label ID is the default. And for import columns, this is going to list all of the default importable fields. And finally, the non-import columns are left blank as this template from our documentation assumes that all fields may be in use. Now we'll use the Import Data app for reference as we build our file. So I'm back in the Data Import app, looking at information for resources. So first, we're going to review the required new row properties to ensure we have minimum requirements to create new resources. So we'll need to ensure that label ID, checkout center, resource type, and meta class are all included on our file. These are the minimum requirements to create a new resource. Let's make sure we've included this information on our import. So I'm going to highlight these 4 required columns just to ensure that I include all of this information. Now let's add a custom property from our instance onto this file. So we're going to add our custom internal note field to the import file. So to include an additional field, we'll copy and paste the header into both the import columns and the data section. So I'm going to copy this header, navigate to my resource file, and paste that header as an import column and also in the data section. So it has to be included in both import column and in the data section. Now, before we start to add any actual data to this file, I always like to remove the columns I'm not using. You do not have to do this, but I always find it easier to work with a simplified file. And for the sake of time, I'll just be adding the required properties and our custom properties to these new resources. So I'm going to delete all of my additional columns. Now let's add our new resources. So in our example, we're going to add a resource to a new resource type already in WebCheckout. So if we navigate into WebCheckout, we're going to look for our resource type for our Canon EF 50mm lens. And as you can see, we have a resource type, and this resource type already has 2 resources assigned to it. So we're going to use the resource import file to add a few more resources to this type. So let's start by adding our label ID. And we'll add about 15 resources. Now, as a quick note, label ID is the unique identifier used for all resources, so there can be no duplicates. So now that we've added label ID, let's update the resource type. This field defines the resource type or category that the resource is assigned to. To add the resource to a resource type already in WebCheckout, we will copy the resource type unique identifier from WebCheckout and paste it into this resource type column. So I'm going to navigate back to WebCheckout, and I always like to copy the unique identifier from the resource type admin tab. And I'm going to copy the resource type ID and paste it into the resource type column and apply it to all of my resources. So now we're going to add meta class. The meta class defines the classification of the resource. Typically, we'll use one of 2 meta classes, equipment or location. So we'll use equipment for this import. And finally, we're going to add the checkout center. So the checkout center should match the checkout center name exactly as it appears in WebCheckout. And I always recommend copying and pasting the name of the checkout center from WebCheckout just to avoid any typos. So I'm back in WebCheckout, and if I go to Admin Checkout Center, in the General tab, you can just copy that checkout center name and paste it into the checkout center column. Now, finally, we're going to add some information to our custom field. In our example, we added a custom internal note field for notes that only operators should see. So let me grab some of my notes about these items. Now that the import file is complete, let's go ahead and import. First, be sure to save the file as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. Now we're going to navigate to WebCheckout, and we're going to back up the database. So this is a very, very important step, which is often overlooked, but we highly recommend backing up the database each and every time you import. Just in case you unexpectedly import something you didn't mean to, our support team can always roll back the database to the date and time of that backup. So to back up the database, we're going to navigate to Admin, Global Settings, and then we're going to click on this Backup Database button. Now, this may take several seconds to several minutes based on the size of your database. And you'll notice this green success banner once that backup is complete. So now we'll navigate to the Import Data app, and we'll navigate to the Import screen. And we're going to start by choosing our file. So I'm going to select Add File and choose my file to import. You'll see feedback about what's on the file, including the number of new records and the number of records to be updated. Now we'll select Validate to ensure that the data on the file is correctly formatted. Now, after each step of the import process, you may see errors present. It is very important to review the errors and click each section for details. So as you can see here, we have 2 validation errors. You can view details of the error by clicking on the error section. Now, as you can see, we have 2 errors from our lens number 1 and 2. And this is actually done because we accidentally duplicated the label ID in our file. And these 2 resource IDs already exist in WebCheckout, but they have a different origin. So for best practice, we recommend resolving any errors before clicking Promote. So we're going to go back to our resource import file, and we're going to solve those errors. Now, since these first 2 label IDs already exist, and I didn't mean to include them on the file, I'm simply going to remove these 2 to resolve that error. And now that I've updated the file, we're going to resave our file as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. And then we're going to try that import again. So I'm going to go back to the Import Data app, and I'm going to click Reset to clear out that previous import. And then we're going to select our new file. And now we're going to click Validate. And finally, we'll click Promote to complete the import. Now, after each step of the import process, as a reminder, you may see errors present. And as a reminder, it's very important to review the errors and click each section for details. So be sure to address those errors on the file and then try the import again. Now let's review our data in WebCheckout on the Find Resource screen. So I'm going to go to Resources, Find Resources, and let's go ahead and check all of our brand new resources. So now, as you can see, we have 15 resources assigned to that Canon EF 50mm lens. So now that we've reviewed how to import new resources, let's review how to export an importable file of existing resources and make changes to resource data. We'll update some resource IDs, which is a new function of advanced imports. Don't try this with the deprecated file. We'll start by navigating to the Find Resource screen. So if you're not already there, you'll want to go to Resources, Find Resources, and we're going to reset our search by clicking Reset. Now, first, we're going to adjust our result columns and our search terms. Now, I only want to change a portion of my inventory's resource IDs, so I'll be using the type search term just to limit results. So we're going to change resource IDs of a different lens type. And we can see that we have about 10 resources under this type. Now, additionally, we'll need to include barcode on our file. Now, since I want to change the resource label ID, we'll need to use another unique identifier, which is barcode, so WebCheckout knows which resources are being updated. So I'm going to click on Result Columns and then add Barcode and select Find Again. And we can see that barcode has now been added to our results. So now we're going to export these results using the Export As option. Now you may have already noticed that under Export As, there are 2 options, Export Importable and Deprecated Export Importable. This deprecated export importable option will export the import file format from version 9.0 and earlier. Please note that this file is called deprecated because eventually advanced imports will replace the existing import files. We recommend your team begins to use the advanced import files now to ensure a seamless transition and adequate time for training. And again, don't try to change resource IDs with this old file. You'll just be creating new resources. Selecting Export Importable will export the new advanced import files. So now that we've exported our files, let's open that file and review. So just like our other file, I already uploaded that exported file to Google Sheets just to save us some time. Now you may have already noticed that the export importable file only includes the required columns to create new resources, plus any additional fields added as result columns. So now you only need to include the fields to update, no more exporting all importable fields. We'll begin in the configuration section. Now, since we want to update resource IDs, we'll need to make a few changes to our lookup columns and to our import columns. To edit the label ID or the resource ID via import, we'll need to switch the lookup column from label ID to barcode. So if you'll recall from our review of the import app information, either label ID or barcode can be used as the lookup column value. This allows you to make updates to either value via import. Let's start by moving label ID to the import columns. Remember, the import columns defines which fields are being updated. So I'm going to copy this header and paste it so that it's now an import column, and we'll remove it as our lookup column. So now we'll need to adjust the lookup column value using a different unique identifier. Again, you can always review the unique ID properties in the import data app. So if we go back to the import data app and click on the information icon and take a look at resource, we can see that we can use either label ID or barcode. So we'll use barcode as our lookup column. So I'm going to copy and paste barcode from import columns to lookup column. And finally, I can either move the fields I'm not updating to this non-import columns field, or I can just delete these columns altogether. So as a reminder, Checkout Center, Resource Type, and Meta Class are required when creating new resources. So these fields are included on the export, but since we're just updating existing resources, these fields can be deleted or moved to a non-import column. All right, so I moved those column headers and made them a non-import column now. So now that we've adjusted the configuration section, we'll need to update the data section. Since we're editing the label ID of these resources, we'll need to make our changes here. So we're going to add the word study hall to our resource IDs. So let's go ahead and update. And then we'll apply changes to all of our resource IDs. So now that the data section and the configuration sections have both been updated, we'll need to save our files and then we can import. So remember, files must be saved as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. Now let's go ahead and import. And as always, we're going to start by backing up our database. So we're going to go to Admin, Global Settings, and we're going to click Backup Database. And now we're going to navigate to the Import Data app. And we're going to click on the Upload option and clear out our previous import. So we're going to start by choosing our file. And then we can click Validate and then finally promote. Now remember, at each of these steps, errors may be present, and as a reminder, it is very, very important to review for errors at each step. Now let's review those changes in WebCheckout. So if I go back to the Find Resource screen, we can see that our resource IDs have now changed and the word study hall has been inserted into that resource ID. Now let's review the patron advanced import file. We'll focus on how to update the patron file to maintain the same behavior of the old import files, which adds and updates patron records and inactivates patrons who are omitted from this file. The default behavior of the patron advanced import file is to add patrons and not deactivate omitted records. So as a reminder, you can download a blank person advanced import file template from our documentation, or you can export existing patron data from WebCheckout into the advanced import template using that export as importable option. So let's review our requirements for the configuration section. Version should be set to 2. Type should be set to person. And origin should be set to external in all caps unless you are specifically updating patron data assigned to a different origin. Label is just a text field for your reference to better label the import. This field is not required and can be omitted. Lookup column. As a reminder, lookup column defines which unique value will be used for the import. Now on my file, I have a lookup column set to user ID. Now I do want to take a minute to note that the field name has changed. It was previously person ID and now it's user ID. So as a quick reminder on the deprecated file, what was person ID is now user ID. Additionally, if user IDs change, but barcode or another unique identifier remains consistent, the barcode or a custom unique identifier should be used as a lookup column, and the user ID would then be an import column. So next we have import columns, and the import column defines the information that is being updated. So at a minimum, when creating new patrons, first name and last name is required in addition to user ID. So you'll notice that as we look at the file, I've included many of the patron fields. However, I've omitted some fields that I wasn't using, like facts. So as we reviewed in the resource imports, by excluding fields in the files, those fields and the data within WebCheckout will be ignored and will not be overwritten. So for those of you who have custom patron integration to exclude certain fields that are not included in the registrar's data, just by simply not including that column in the integration file, those fields will be protected and a custom is no longer required. Next, we have non-import columns. Non-import columns allows columns in the file to be ignored from import. You most likely will not need to include non-import columns, as you can just delete columns not used from the data section. And finally, we have our action row. The action on the patron advanced import file allows you to determine if patrons excluded from the file should be inactivated in WebCheckout. So please note that all actions are included on the templates downloaded from our documentation site. However, actions are not pre-populated when exporting an importable file from the Find People screen. Now again, the default behavior is to only add or update data of active patrons and does not inactivate omitted patrons. Action should only be included if your intention is to deactivate patrons not included on this file. So if you are looking to update existing patron data or add additional patrons, please remove the action row from your file. Now, just as we reviewed earlier, there are 3 actions which can be included on the action row of the patron file: deactivate excluded, unsafe, and verbose. Deactivate excluded is the primary action while unsafe and verbose are supplementary options to add to deactivate excluded. Deactivate excluded, when included on the patron file, will inactivate excluded patrons of the set origin that are not included on the file. So if I import this file with the deactivate excluded action, only these 7 patrons will remain active, and all other patrons with the external origin in WebCheckout will become inactive. So if you are deactivating excluded patron records, you may also want to add one or both of the following supplementary actions. Unsafe. So when you include unsafe, this will allow deactivation of all patrons of the set origin in the import file when no data is included in the data section. So if you do inactivate all patrons, such as during breaks or at the end of the semester, this would be a good use case for adding unsafe to your file and no patron data. Our general recommendation is to exclude unsafe and only add that action if you need to inactivate all patrons. The other supplementary action is verbose. So when added, a list of deactivated records will display on the import data app. So we recommend adding verbose to the file just so you can review feedback immediately. Now on my file, I'm going to include both deactivate excluded and verbose, but I'm going to omit unsafe. Now with actions on all files, we always recommend being very aware of the action row, as by including actions will allow WebCheckout to inactivate excluded patrons. Now let's review the data section. You'll need to keep this begin data header before the data section. Now the data section is going to be formatted almost exactly the same as the deprecated file. However, as a quick reminder, person ID has changed to user ID on the advanced file. Now, once the file is updated, we can import using the import data app. This import will inactivate a majority of my patrons since I've included the deactivate excluded action. But this is our goal. So we're going to go ahead and save our file as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. And now let's import our file. But we're going to start by backing up our database. So I'm going to go to Admin, Global Setting, and we are going to back up once again. And now we're going to import in the Import Data app. We're going to start by choosing our file. And then we're going to select Validate and then finally Promote. Now at each of these steps, errors may be present. Now after you select Validate, you will see a header with import action messages if you have included that verbose action. And this is going to display a list of all patrons that will become inactive. So you'll see a lot of patrons here. Now, inactivated patrons do not have access to log into WebCheckout or the patron portal. Now let's select Promote to finalize this import. All right. So now that we've reviewed how to update the patron file, let's review how to update group files. So you will notice similarities between the patron file and the group file. Let's start with our group file. If you want to see how your own group data will appear on the advanced import file, I recommend exporting current data on the Find Group screen using the Export as Importable option. So in WebCheckout, you can export the advanced group file format by going to Authorizations, Find Groups, and go ahead and select Export As and Export Importable. This will export the advanced group file. So we're going to review requirements for our configuration setting first. So version should be set to 2, and you've probably noticed that all advanced import files should have version set to 2. Type, this should be set to group. Origin, we recommend this is set to external in all caps unless you have specific data set to a different origin that you would like to update. Label, label can be omitted. This is just a text field to label your import. Lookup columns should include group identifier. Group identifier is the unique key for each group. Group identifier was previously unique identifier on the deprecated file. Import columns should include all of the columns that you would like to update with this import. All columns that appear as an import column must also be included below within the data section. At a minimum, when creating new groups, you must include organization. Now, non-import columns should only be included if the data or columns included in the data section should be excluded from this import. And action. The action row of the group advanced import file includes the same 3 options we just reviewed on the patron file and will inactivate any groups not included on this file. So this action is new to groups. So previously, the only way to inactivate groups by import was to include an end date. So if you would like the advanced import to behave as the deprecated import file, the advanced import file must exclude the action row entirely or leave this field blank. Now with the deactivate excluded action included, any omitted groups will become inactive. So if I import this file with this deactivate excluded action set, only these 4 groups would remain active. All other groups with the origin of external will be inactivated. Inactivated groups will end section members' access to restricted resource types, patron portals, and checkout centers. The deactivate excluded action should only be included if your goal is to inactivate excluded groups. Now there's also unsafe and verbose. Unsafe when added will allow deactivation of groups when no group data is present in this data section. Our general recommendation is to not include unsafe unless you are intentionally trying to inactivate all groups. Verbose. Verbose, when added, the import data app will display that list of deactivated data, just like we saw with the patron import. So we recommend always adding verbose to the file if you're using a deactivate excluded action. Now on my file, I'm going to omit the action field entirely since I want to maintain the same behavior of groups not included on the file to remain as is. So I'm just going to delete this row entirely. So to clarify, since I've omitted the action field, no groups will be inactivated from this import. So this import will only make changes to the groups referenced in the data section. Now let's review our data section. So 2 headers have changed. So the unique identifier header has changed to group unique identifier. And if you were using the contact unique identifier field, that has changed to simply contact. Now, once the file is updated, you can import this file through the import data app. We'll import this file along with the section and the section member file. So now let's review our section file. Sections are assigned to groups, and then patrons are members assigned to those sections. All groups must include sections to grant patrons access to the authorization set. Let's review how to update the section file with requirements for advanced import. We'll focus on adding the configuration settings and adjusting a few headers in the data section. Now you can find configuration requirements in the exported section file or on our templates from our documentation. Now to export section and section member files, both can be updated on the Find Section screen. So if you go to Authorizations, Find Sections in WebCheckout, and then select Export As and Export Importable, this will export both the section and the section member files in the advanced import format. So now let's review the configuration section. Version. So just like all other files, version must be set to 2. Type must be set to section, and origin, we recommend that this is set to external in all caps unless you are specifically trying to update data set to a different origin. Label can be omitted. This is just a text field to label your import. Lookup column should include section identifier. So this is a unique key used for each individual section. Section identifier was previously labeled as unique identifier on the deprecated file. Import column should include all columns you would like to update with this import. So as a quick reminder, all columns that appear as an import column must also be included below in the data section. And the minimum required import columns to import a new section is name and also group. So those are the minimum requirements. Now, please note that column headers, group and contact, which you'll notice listed here, were previously labeled group unique identifier and contact unique identifier. Non-import columns should only be included if data or columns appear in the file that you do not want to be updated by this import. So you can always delete non-required columns. And finally, we have action. So similar to both the patron and groups and group file, you can include an action to deactivate sections omitted from this file. The only difference with sections is that the section advanced import file includes the option to inactivate omitted sections and also omitted section members. Now, deactivate excluded will inactivate sections of the set origin that are not referenced on this section file. So if I was to use the deactivate excluded action on this file, all other sections with an origin of external would be inactivated, leaving only these 6 sections as active. Inactivating sections will end section member access to restricted resource types, patron portals, and checkout centers. Now there's also the deactivate excluded members action, and this action will inactivate section members of the reference sections not included on the members file. So this action specifically refers to data on the section members file, but the action is set on the section file. So on this next tab, this is the section member file we haven't yet reviewed. So for those of you who are familiar with the way that the deprecated section member file works, adding the action deactivate excluded members will inactivate omitted members from the sections in the members file. So sections not included in the members file will be ignored and members will remain as is. Additionally, when using deactivate excluded members action, you must load and import the section and section member file together for this action to work properly. So we'll review how to do that shortly. If you want the same behavior of the deprecated section and section member files that you're used to, you'll only want to include this deactivate excluded members action. With this, there will be no deactivation for the section, only for the section members. If the deactivate actions are not included on the section and section member files, these files will only be additive and will not inactivate sections or members. Now, finally, there is also the unsafe and verbose supplemental actions, which can be used in addition to either deactivate excluded or deactivate excluded members. Now on my file, I'm going to omit deactivate excluded and also omit unsafe, leaving only the deactivate excluded members and verbose action so that the import file allows the existing import behavior, and I receive feedback on which members are now inactive from omission on the members file. So now let's review the data section. Now some column names have changed, including unique identifier, group unique identifier, and contact unique identifier. So the unique identifier header has changed to section identifier. Group unique identifier has changed to just group. And as a quick reminder, this references that group that joins a section to the group. And finally, if you're using that contact unique identifier column, this header has changed to just contact. Now, non-required and unused columns can be completely deleted from this file, or if they're included on this file and not in use, be sure to include them as a non-import column in the configuration area. So now that we've updated our section file, let's turn our attention to the section member file. The section member file assigns patrons or section members to sections. Let's review how to update the section member file. The section member file can be exported from WebCheckout on that Find section screen using the Export as Importable option, or you can download a blank template from our documentation. So let's begin with the configuration section. Version, just like all other files, should be set to 2. Type should be set to section member, and origin, we recommend that this is set to external in all caps unless your goal is to update data assigned to a specific origin. Label can be omitted. This is just a text field to label your import. Now, lookup column should be set to both section and member. So this is significant and slightly different than the other files. Now, section was previously labeled section unique identifier and refers to the unique value for sections. Member was previously labeled member unique identifier and refers to that patron's unique identifier user ID. Import columns should include any columns you would like to add or update with this import. The only additional columns on the section member file are start date and end date. So if you're not using these 2 columns, your file may contain no import columns, no non-import columns, and the only information you would have are your lookup columns. So now you will notice that there's no action row, but I've included this note right here. So there's no action row on the section member file. As we just reviewed, the action to deactivate excluded members is found on the section file. So if we go back to the section file, we have deactivate excluded members action here. Always be sure to double check that the proper action is included on the section file before finalizing your section member file. All right. Now, because I've included the deactivate excluded members action in our section file, the import will inactivate all omitted members from the reference section on the members file. Now, if we look at our example, we can see that there are 2 sections referenced. There's a section for our Photo 101, Monday, Wednesday, Friday section, and our Red Camera authorized users. So these are our only 2 sections that will have membership updated and will inactivate members that are omitted from this file. All other members in this section file and in WebCheckout already will remain as is. So now let's review how to update this data section. For those of you familiar with the deprecated files, as a quick reminder, column header names have been updated. So section unique identifier is now just section, and member unique identifier is now just member. Since I'm not going to use start or end date on the section member file, I'm just going to delete these columns entirely. So I'm going to delete start and end date from the data section, and I'm also going to remove them from the import columns because we want all of the columns in our data section to be referenced up top as either a lookup, import, or non-import column. So now that we've updated our files, let's update these 3 files. So as always, we're going to start by backing up our database. So once again, we're going to go to Admin, Global Settings, and we're going to click Backup Database. So now let's start with our group file. So I'm navigating back to our group file. And as a quick reminder, the group import will only be additive since I've removed actions from the group file. Now let's go ahead and save this file and import. So as a quick reminder, we do have to save this file as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. And now we're going to navigate to the Import Data app. And we're going to reset the Import Data screen. And we're going to start by choosing our group file. And then we can select Validate. And then finally, you can select Promote. Now remember, at each of these steps, errors may be present, and it's always important to review for any errors. Now let's import the section and the section member file. Now, as a reminder, since we are using this deactivate excluded members action, we must load and import the section and the section member file together in order for this action to work properly. So both files, the section and section member files, must be imported together. So let's save both the section and the section member files. And just as a quick reminder, both files must be saved as a CSV with UTF-8 encoding. So now we're going to navigate to our Import Data app and reset the Import Data screen once again. And let's import the section and the section member files. Now, as a quick reminder, to import properly, you must load both the section and the section member files together before selecting Validate. So first, I'm going to choose my section file. And then before I do anything else, I'm going to click Add Files a second time and choose that member file. So now that both files are loaded, and you'll see that 2 files have been loaded, now we're going to select Validate and then Promote. Now remember, at each of these steps, errors may be present, and it is recommended that you review errors before proceeding to the next step. Additionally, when you're using one of those deactivate actions and verbose together, you will see this import action members headers, and you can view a list of section members that will become inactive. So now we're going to select Promote to finalize that import. Now, while I did import the groups separately from sections and members, I could have uploaded all 3 files together and even the resource file all at once. So this is a new benefit of advanced imports. So now that we've successfully reviewed our import scenarios, this completes our advanced import review today. So to summarize what we reviewed today, Advanced Import feature is available in version 12. Template files are available on our documentation site and by exporting the export importable files from the respective bind screens in WebCheckout. The Import app also documents importable data properties, including custom properties unique to your instance. Some column header names have changed, most dropping the unique identifier from the name. Import files includes the new configuration section and is required. The row begin data is also required. Columns, also known as properties, which are omitted from the import file, will not be overwritten and null out the value in WebCheckout. This is new behavior. By default, records that are omitted from the patron, group, section, or section member files will remain active. This is also new behavior. In order to deactivate excluded records, the proper inactivation action is required. Now, advanced import will make importing easier and leave a lot less room for error. So, as a quick reminder, we always recommend backing up the database before importing. And now when we send our follow-up email, we will be providing today's recording, links to our documentation, and where to find example files we reviewed together. So do we have any questions? All right.
Brittany, I think your demonstration and explanations were so thorough. Oh, but we do have some questions. Saida, I'll unmute you, or I think you can unmute yourself.
I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really helpful, informative. We just started doing some advanced import. AJ helped me a lot, and we finally got the hang of it. It's going great. I had a question though. What would be your recommendation or sort of best practices to follow for switching over equipment from one organization to another? So basically, I'm currently working on consolidating a couple of organizations, and we want to move over all resource types and resources from this org to another org. I've done a lot of updating of information within resource types and resources already using advanced import. But before I go ahead and do any changes of organizations or moving over checkout centers from one org to another, I wanted to see if you could sort of show me an example or have any suggestions or things to keep in mind. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it will require kind of several steps. So you're not going to be able to move all of your resources and types over in one single import. And I would recommend starting with your resources first.
Right.
And rather than trying to move those types, I would recommend probably duplicating those types first in the correct org, or assigning those resources to existing types in that org, because you'll find if you try to move your resource types with circulation data, you'll be unable to move. So when you go to export your resource file, what you want to focus on is updating your resource type column in addition to your checkout center column. So you want to start first by ensuring that your new org has all of the resource types you need. And then you'll focus on moving resource types, and you'll want to update both your resource type column to assign to the correct type in the new org, and then also the checkout center column. Does that make sense?
Okay, so I think I was concerned about duplicating resource types in another organization. So I kind of took the longer route, but yeah, that makes it actually a lot easier and clearer. So it's okay if I just duplicate all those resource types in the new organization, as long as I move the resources with the same types and the types are duplicated, that's fine.
And just to be clear what I mean by duplicate, because I was a little vague by that, I mean you would have resource types, and I don't have a type file in front of me right now, but you would have resource types with the same name and the same organization, so it would look the same to the user, but the resource type unique identifier would be different. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So I just recently updated all our unique identifiers as well. Okay, I'm gonna think about this a little bit and then follow up with another question after.
Excellent.
And Saida, we could also have a call with AJ, and I can also assist with this too.
Okay, sounds
we could
good.
use some Excel functions of VLOOKUP to quickly assign the new identifiers to your resources, and we can help walk you through this change.
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, great. We have another question. Ian.
Oh, hi there.
Hello.
We've been still using the the old files, but these have been so seductive. I'm ready to make that move. But I have a question about the origin field in the advanced import. Um, I, I know that when I was putting this together, like in a very kind of tight time frame, I was making some groups like within WebCheckout, and then some got made and imported. So my guess is that that some of my groups or sections or whatever are going to be internal or are going to be local because I made them within the system, and then some are going to be external because I did not make them in the system. So updating, I would have to do it both ways. If I'm just not like clear, how do I fix that?
Yeah, so what I would recommend doing first is actually updating your origin so you are working with one consistent origin. So if you're thinking you're going to be doing a lot of updates, you can change the origin using the advanced import, which is actually a new feature of advanced import. So if we were to say, take a look at our resources. So I'm on the Find Resource screen. I could include a search term for origin. And let's say I wanted to update all of my local records and move them and make them external. I would include that search term for local. And then I would also want to include that as a result column so it appears on my import file. So I would look for the same column header name. And then when I go to select records, these are all of my local resource records in WebCheckout. And then I could export using export as importable. And then on this file, you would focus on updating the origin column. So let me see if I'm able to actually open this file.
I don't think we'll be able to actually see it,
Yeah.
but it would just be updating the data field origin. It would say local and just updating that field to external. And then
Correct.
importing it.
And there's no good reason to have it be local other than when you're looking at it, you could see that, oh yeah, that was made locally, right? There's
We
not.
can see it.
Yep. So you may be able to see my file now. So this is in Excel.
Yep.
Yeah.
These are all my local origins. You would want to change this field in the data section to show it's external. But before you do that, you're going to want to swap out the origin of your import. So you're importing to local. So you're basically inverting the origins, how they come when they're exported. So I'm importing to the local origin, but I'm swapping the origin of my data to external. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to not do that, right?
I would recommend updating it if you foresee yourself making changes. I find local to be helpful if you have records you specifically want to protect. So if you have patrons who are administrators and you want to make sure they're never updated by the import or inactivated, then you would probably want to leave those patron records as local.
Got it. But like section member should always be external anyway, right? Or
Typically, I would recommend that unless there's multiple departments that want to use their own origin to update data, or you have something really unique going on that you would need differing origins.
okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, thanks, Brittany. We have a question from Lily. Lily, feel free to chat or just discuss. I know you chatted a question as well.
Hi, this is Lily Young. So our question is for we talked there, I see that the ones to import files and on manually. What about the integration? It's daily or nightly? And so does that now accept the new format file data or is still doing the old format?
Yeah, so I believe in version 12, we can use either the deprecated file format that you're used to, so you don't have to make the change. But if you're ready to make that change, you can update your files to the advanced format. And I would recommend trying it out in version 12 so that your files are ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Another one,
Yes.
is the groups. If the course enrollment group, I just received a request to change it from one organization to a other one. So what's the best way to do it? So just insert a duplicate group in another organization, or is a way just to, when they import groups with a new organization, immediately change it? Or
That is a good question.
So Lily, so your question is, are you looking just to change the group's organization from organization A to organization B?
yes.
Sure. So in the group file, the one that actually Brittany has on screen right now,
Yeah.
right now these groups belong to organization WebCo Production.
Yeah.
You actually just need to include the updated organization name. So if it belongs to OCAD, we could just change the organization name to OCAD and it would be assigned to, it would move from one organization to the other.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And I know Brittany mentioned this on the call earlier, but this is a good reminder. These advanced imports, this will be the way we import, and what you're currently used to are the deprecated import. The user interface will be phased out by the end of the year. So if you're not already on version 12, we highly recommend updating and get familiar, start using the new imports, because in 2022, we'll no longer support the old import mechanism. And actually by the end of 2021, we will no longer support it. And Lily, I should mention, if the group is moving organizations, nope, sections do not belong to an organization. Never mind. It should be a simple just data update. Okay, great. Any other questions?
Maybe I could get a clarification. The groups are global though, correct? Groups are global between orgs in an institution, if I'm not mistaken, right?
No, groups are organizationally specific. They're specific to an organization.
Oh, okay.
But groups can have access to resource types in multiple organizations. So if you think of a group as, if you think of like a global group, like you have a faculty group that have access to equipment in multiple organizations, that group does have to be assigned to a specific organization. But with authorization sets, this was kind of my long-winded explanation to Dale, you can have an authorization set that's assigned to the specific organization that has the resource types, and then assign that authorization set to that group. So the group belongs to WebCheckout production, but under WebCheckout production, there is the TV organization. The TV organization has a bunch of resource types. It can create an authorization set and delegate that authorization set to WebCo production, so that group can have access to that equipment at a different organization.
Okay, so it'd be an offset in another org can be granted permission to a group outside of that org.
Correct, yes.
Do we have any other questions?
Maybe one more about the unsafe element of the
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah.
So the deactivate excluded, I get that, and verbose, I get, you should like always be verbose. But sometimes unsafe was you kept it unsafe and sometimes you did not keep unsafe. And I don't think I quite understand what the difference was when deactivate excluded, deactivates excluded.
Yeah, so for unsafe, I always recommend thinking about how you typically inactivate patron or group or section data at your institution. So if you do inactivate all patrons across the board, right? There are times when you just inactivate all patrons, like between breaks or at the end of the semester. You may want to include unsafe and then have 0 data in the data section. So when I run this file, as long as unsafe is included, WebCheckout will say, okay, time to inactivate all patrons of external. But if unsafe isn't included on this and there's no data present, WebCheckout will be like, uh-oh, this is an error. We're not inactivating anything. Does that make sense?
Oh, so like unsafe is just
Means
gonna
that you,
it's gonna make it so it doesn't throw errors when it deactivates excluded.
so unsafe will allow you to inactivate all patrons if no data is present. By removing unsafe, so let me go ahead and add my data back in. By removing this unsafe cell right here, this is me telling WebCheckout, I don't for any reason want to inactivate all patrons. So if I mess up my file and I don't include any data because I've excluded unsafe, my data is protected.
Got
Does
it.
that make sense?
Maybe if I give an example, we used to have, especially at the beginning or at the end of the semester, we'd have a lot of clients email us very frustrated that they can't log into WebCheckout and everyone was inactivated because it was the end of the semester and the file that was produced out of Active Directory or the registrar's office had no student information, no faculty, nobody. It was completely blank just with the header because the data was just, because it was in between semesters, and it would inactivate everyone. And so as we don't want this kind of auto magic things happening in WebCheckout, we now include this action unsafe. So Brittany mentioned here, we're being more intentional with the files. So if the file has no data and you include the action unsafe, you're intentionally inactivating all patrons by omission of any data in the file.
Got it.
Great. Annie?
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I was going in and out of the training, so I apologize if you already mentioned it. So I have 2 questions. The first one is, let's say I want to follow the training that you talked about and changing all my local resources into external. The minimal amount of data is technically just the label ID and the origin.
Yes.
I don't need
So,
to do anything.
so
And when
minimum
I
label ID.
export to importable, the action column doesn't automatically show up. Do I need to manually add it?
So those are great questions. So for changing the origin, the minimum requirements you would need is a lookup column set to label ID. And then your import column should include origin, and that's all you would need. I recommend removing everything else or moving it to non-import column. And then actions, you are correct. They will not, when you export files from WebCheckout, they will not be included on any files so that there's no accidental deactivation. But those actions can only be included on certain files, such as group, section, and patron files. And you would either need to add those in, or you can download the templates from our documentation, which includes all of those actions. So you have an example.
Cool. Okay, so that was for second question is completely not related. Our web checkout is not synced up with Active Directory. So every year in the fall, we manually import all the patrons. And because if there's any patron with address change or cell phone change, they ended up being with the old traditional method, their all record becomes inactive and then they have another new active account created. with the events import, is there a way for me to consolidate it? Because in a way, I still want to keep the record saying Annie Lau reserved equipment in the past, but that account was inactivated, but there's a new one now with a different patron ID, but it's technically the same person.
So quick question, when you say they get a new person ID, you're talking about their user ID or person ID in WebCheckout, is that correct?
Yes.
Do they have another consistent identifier outside of that person ID, like a barcode
Their
or?
email should remain the same, although occasionally there are some exception when people get married and they change their last name, their email's different. But if anything, the email would be the most consistent lookup column, basically.
Perfect. So with that, essentially your lookup column, right? If you know user ID is something that changes, you wouldn't want to use that as your lookup column. That should be an import column. So we'll need to use a new lookup column. So by default, you could include barcode, or you can add a custom unique identifier. And that's found if you go into global settings. You can add custom properties, and you'll see an option under person. There's a new option called unique ID, and this makes another unique identifier that can be used for your patron imports. You could create a custom unique identifier that could reference, say, email address if that remains consistent, or if there's a separate unique identifier. But you would add this first, and then you could add that to your patron import file.
Okay. But I guess my question is, now Annie Lau already existed 2 times because it's been 2 years. My old account got deactivated and I have a new account, but now we're on the 3rd year where I'm trying to do advanced import this time on the 3rd time. Which account would it actually replace? Because both accounts are Annie Lau at SCU, except one's deactivated and one's activated account.
So it would say update whichever patron file has the matching unique identifier. So if we create a custom unique identifier, you could add that to one, but not both of their old records. And then you would at least be able to activate one of those records rather than making a 3rd. Does that make sense?
It makes sense now, but I don't know if it'll make sense when I'm doing it. So
yeah, that's a pretty specific question to your needs. Okay. So when you're ready to do that, or like a few days or a week before, I recommend reaching out to us.
Okay.
And we'd be happy to assist so that you understand step by steps and your data's looking good.
Okay, thank you.
I have a related question then, because I think I saw in like old versions of WebCheckout, we could reactivate a deactivated user. And because I ended up with the same type of a deal, I have one user that's just not visible in the system because they have a user ID that has been deactivated. Is there a way to reactivate a deactivated ID now?
Yeah, so any inactivated patron, is going to be reactivated when you import them on the patron import file. So if they're included, as long as they're of the same origin, they'll be reactivated. But also if you're in WebCheckout and kind of just have one record that's being a little difficult, you can, in the admin tab of the patron record, you can update status. But if the origin of that patron record is the same of the import, you also want to ensure that that patron record makes its way onto the patron import, or it will become inactive again.
Yeah, because I mean, in looking for it in WebCheckout, I could find no record, but when trying to add that person, they wouldn't add it because that unique identifier already existed.
Got it. It sounds to me like this is an issue with that person's unique identifier. Either being inactive. So when you search for patrons by default, right, you're only going to see active. You would have to click the options to view inactive or deleted records, or that person ID could be used as a barcode for another person, and right, that potentially be causing issue as well.
Brittany, can I pitch something to you really quickly? I believe that status is also an importable
It is.
column. So you could do a search for the user ID that you're looking for, or if you've got dozens, for example, you could just do a search for all inactive users. You can export it, and you can go in and hand change their status from inactive to active, and then run an import, and it will reactivate a large group of people that way.
Very efficient. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. I think that was Lee.
You bet. I'm here. I'm here for you.
Are there any other questions? No other questions? All right.
Thanks so much, Brittany. That was, again, very thorough, and it was a great refresher for me. And actually, I learned a few things as well. As a reminder, if you're ready to upgrade to version 12, email support@webcheckout.net to schedule your upgrade. The deprecated import, what you're familiar with, will be phased out by the end of this year. So get started, familiarize yourself with the advanced imports. And with that, we are offering a special discount, 25% off on professional services hours. So if you want more one-on-one time review on version 12, new features and advanced imports, we've got special pricing going on, and we'll include this information on the follow-up email, which will come out early next week. And then finally, for our next study hall, which will be featured in May, we will be highlighting our spring release. Just some notable features we wanted to introduce you to. The spring release will include RRT resource selection options. So you'll now have the option to choose what resources or what kind of resource Web Checkout will select when assigning to a reservation by type. So you have the first feasible, maximize resource availability, or spread resource usage. We'll demonstrate and show you this in our next study hall. We also have several policy improvements. With the policy improvements, you're now able to inherit or merge policies between resource types. Right, so this has actually been a wish or a request from many customers where they have, let's say, 2 different cameras, and they want to make sure that you can only check out one of the cameras and you can only use them for a certain amount of hours. You can now do that with these new improvements to policies. We also improved just the user interface, that now you can view policies, which policies apply to that specific checkout or reservation, and we've organized policies by usage and operations. Again, we'll demonstrate that at our next study hall. And finally, another great new feature, you're now able to download and print up to 100 agreement forms at a time, so batch printing. And this was a great new feature sponsored by Emerson College, so thank you guys for sponsoring that. So as always, it was great to see and hear from many of you. And you can always find us at support@webcheckout.net. You can email us at support@webcheckout.net. And our account managers, we're always here to help you guys with your questions. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Thanks, gang.
Thank you.